although he had a tour in Janesville and in the Master's Apprentice program through York College before I came up here, but he went to Kansas and then came back the same year I came back. So, but Roy and I have worked in camp together. We've served on the camp board together. We've done a lot of things together, and I've really grown to appreciate Roy. He's a very grace-filled, merciful person, and I want to welcome him tonight, and I'm sure that we're going to get a lot out of his lessons. His lesson tonight, I believe the title is The Dark Journey of Jeffrey Dahmer. So I look forward to what he has to say for us this evening.
It's a real honor to be here tonight. I always enjoy talking about the experience I had with Jeffrey Dahmer. In 1994, I baptized Jeffrey Dahmer and made a lot of news doing that. It wasn't my intention to do that, but I got into an awful lot of newspapers doing it. And some of the results are here on your communion table. You can look at these later on when you want to. Some of them are newspaper articles that picture me. Some of them are just newspaper articles in reaction to the baptism of Jeffrey Dahmer and so forth. And some of them deal with there's a place where he makes a request for baptism, and he's got his signature signed, and there's a card he gave me the last time I saw him that's there, as well as a Thanksgiving Day card. And then there's an article about his mother when she died, and there's a book written by his father. There's just a lot of little interesting things that you might find interesting there. So when you have an opportunity, you might want to go up. I'll just leave this here all day tomorrow. And then because I know you use that table Sunday, I won't have it there Sunday. But for those who want to look at it, there's a lot of interesting stuff you can kind of look at and kind of get an idea of what's going on. I was encouraged to write a book about my experience, and it's taken me several years to get the job done. It's taken me several years because I live a pretty active life. I'm a minister. I've been a minister in the Churches of Christ for full-time for 35 years. I've been an elder in the church there in Madison since 1996, so it'll be coming up on 10 years this year that I've been an elder. And in addition to that, since the Jeffrey Dahmer experience, I've gotten introduced into prison ministry, so there's 7 prisoners that I visit each month. And so I'm a pretty busy guy, and stopping for a while to write a chapter, it just took some time. And then I wrote the book, and then everyone looked at it and said, no. So I rewrote the book, and then, no. So I rewrote the book a third time, and finally Leonard Allen agreed to publish it, so it's in the process of a publisher being looked at right now, and he's hoping to have it published by May of this year. So we'll see if that happens or not. I'll be praising God. They want to do some fine-tuning, such as changing the title. The title I'd given it was, I called him Jeff. The idea being, I didn't call him Dahmer, I called him Jeff. He was a real person to me, and he had a real life, and he had real feelings, just like everyone else did. But they want to change the title to Dark Journey, Deep Grace. And I like the idea, so I borrowed that title for the first lesson tonight, The Dark Journey of Jeffrey Dahmer. And what I want to do is, for those of you who don't remember Jeffrey Dahmer or don't know what I'm talking about, is to kind of review some of the crimes he committed and how did he get into the path that led him into these ways and so forth. A lot of people, when they hear the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, they want to ask the question, why did you do that? How did he come about to do that? What drove him to do these sorts of things and so forth? And of course the correct answer is, I don't know, nor does anyone else know. As a matter of fact, I can share with you that even Jeff didn't know. There was a time when we were discussing together about psychologists who had studied him, and he lamented to me, why did they stop studying me? I wanted them to explain to me why I did what I did. So even he didn't have a good answer as to why he did what he did. He was hoping that the wise men of his age could tell him and so forth. But we'll spend a little bit of time looking at that and trying to understand a little bit of the history of that tonight, try to understand where he went, how he got into this. And then I want to spend a little bit of time asking about the kind of damage that his life brought, especially on his family members. And some of them I know a little bit about. So I want to share a little bit of that with you tonight as we deal with the dark journey of Jeffrey Dahmer. And then tomorrow morning, or tomorrow, I'm not sure when we're doing it, in the morning, in the afternoon, at what time are we?
We're doing one morning, one session, one in the afternoon.
Okay, so sometime tomorrow morning, we'll deal with the conversion of Jeffrey Dahmer. How does he come to faith? And why does he want to be baptized? And where does he get this idea that he should be baptized and so forth? And then the baptism experience that I experienced with him. And then developing his faith, which occurred for about 6 months after he was baptized. I met with him every week for the 6 months after he was baptized until he himself was murdered. And then, of course, my ministry to him ended. But then it was a matter of dealing with his father, his brother, other family members of his, and so forth, and dealing with it. So tomorrow morning we'll deal with the conversion and the Christianity of Jeffrey Dahmer, and then tomorrow evening we'll deal with the death and the memorial and the reactions people had to the story of Jeffrey Dahmer. And then Sunday morning I'm going to deal with more theological issues. So we'll deal with the story, first of all, of the story of Jesus and the story of Jeffrey Dahmer. And if you didn't realize it, those two stories relate to each other. And if you don't realize it, I'll try to explain it to you on Sunday morning. And then later on we'll deal with the struggles in grace, where a lot of people have a hard time accepting Jeffrey Dahmer's Christianity. And so we want to spend a little time dealing with our own struggle with grace and how we struggle with grace and so on. So that gives you kind of a preview of where I want to go with all of this. How did he get into all of this? What happened with Jeffrey Dahmer? Most of us don't know much about the story of Jeffrey Dahmer. It occurred rather quickly for us. It came up to us all of a sudden. They weren't looking for the mass murderer or the monster of Milwaukee before they discovered Jeffrey Dahmer. His discovery was something of a surprise. It was kind of a serendipity sort of thing. Two police officers were sitting there one night, and a man was running down the street with handcuffs on his arm, and his shirt was out, and he's just running like crazy, and they thought he had escaped from a policeman. So they stopped the man. His name was Tracy Edwards. What's going on here? Why do you have these handcuffs? And he tells this bizarre story of meeting a man, and a man inviting him back to his hotel, the man drugging him, the man puts a knife to his neck and threatens to kill him, and that somehow he escaped and he was wanting to bring them back to them. And of course the officers kind of looking at each other thinking, right, this guy is on some kind of drug, he's just making this up, we don't know what's going on. So they go back to the apartment. And of course they notice a strange smell when they come to the apartment, and all the neighbors have been complaining about a strange smell. This strange smell, of course, was rotting human flesh, is what it comes down to. But they enter into the apartment, and they're having a cordial visit with the young man there. His name is Jeffrey Dahmer. And they ask for I think it was some identification, and he gets up to go into the back room, and then Tracy Edwards says, that's where he's keeping the knife. So the police officers stop him, and they make him sit down, and they go into the room, and there they find not only a knife, but they find photographs of body parts, mutilated body parts, and they begin to examine more and more, and you discover a very bizarre scene there. It becomes very apparent that something is wrong. Something is horribly, horribly wrong. And so for most of us, July 22nd, 1991 was the first time we hear the story. And when you first hear the story, most of us, if you're like me, just heard it as a passing news story, and it was not something you spent a lot of time with, but it was something you heard and you thought, well, that was really bizarre. That was strange. Imagine that in Milwaukee. And of course, the further they got into the whole thing, then you get more and more of the kind of mutilations that are described. And I don't want to get into too much of that, but I'll have to discuss a little bit of that in case you're completely unaware. And eventually you hear about cannibalism, which for most people is probably the most nauseating part of the story. And a lot of people have a hard time coming to terms with that. How can there be a man in sophisticated United States, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who's doing these things? This is not East Borneo, where you hunt your enemy down and you kill him and then you eat his body up as sort of a victory dance over him. This is not that kind of civilization. We just don't do that here. How is it possible that that could happen here? And more to the point, part of the shock Milwaukee went through is, how did this happen under our noses and we never noticed? The people who were missing were not well known in being missed. There weren't posters being put up very much about these people. There weren't, because these people were the kind of people who usually came up missing a lot, and their family members just thought, well, they're missing again, and they'll show up again. And so as the names begin to open up and begin to appear, then you have a great deal of grief that is occurring as well. In his book, when Lionel Dahmer talks about how the policemen came to his house and began to tell him about all these terrible crimes, he went into a deep shock himself. And was expecting to hear that his son was one of the victims. And shock of all shocks, his son was not one of the victims. His son was the one who killed all the people. And he had a very hard time believing it. Very hard time. Try to put yourself in his shoes. It's not hard for you to do that, I think. Many of us are Christians. We all have children. all struggled in raising our children. Some of us struggle more, some of us struggle less, but we all understand the difficulty in raising a child. And sometimes your child will do something that surprises you, and sometimes your child will do something that humiliates you and embarrasses you. And I don't know that I can think of anything probably more humiliating and more embarrassing than to be thrown out into the public with your child having committed such horrible, horrible crimes. Let me see if I can jump ahead a little bit from my text and just kind of get a little more into this. How did all this happen? When did all this start and so forth? And I'm going more on memory than I'm going to be dealing with a lot of this. For Jeffrey Dahmer, much of it began when he was much younger. And it's a little bit hard to identify and pick up on all these things. After I had been working with Jeffrey Dahmer for a few months, my wife, who at that time was working in a library, had encouraged me to read some of the books about Jeffrey Dahmer. I had not done that at that point. I had read and got the gist of the headlines and got the general gist of what was all about, but I never really got to the depth of the gore and the blood and all that sort of stuff like that. And so I went ahead and read 5 books from the library about Jeffrey Dahmer, and they went into great detail about his crimes. And those books are available in the libraries, I suppose, if you still want to read them, if you're really into a lot of ooze and blood and guts, you might enjoy those kinds of stories. I don't know. But I also read the story by his father, called The Father's Story, where he details the father's reaction to all of this and how he felt about all of this as well. And I remember telling Jeff afterward that I'd read these books, and I was a little bit embarrassed to tell him that. And he naturally was curious and said, well, what did you think after you read these things? And I said, and by this time I'd been meeting with him every week. After I baptized him, I met with him every week, like I said, for about 6 months before he was murdered. And I said my conclusion was that none of these people knew you very well. They write as if they know you, they write as if they understand you, but it's apparent to me that they don't know you very well. And that includes his own father, by the way. I felt that his father's book indicated that his father, although he had raised him and knew him as a father would to a son, really didn't know the person Jeffrey Dahmer the way I knew the person Jeffrey Dahmer, the way I'd come to know him and so forth. And that didn't surprise Jeff. And one of the complaints Jeff had at that time was that all these people write about how lonesome I was and how much of a loner I was. He said, I had friends. I had lots of friends. Well, everything you read about Jeffrey Dahmer suggests that he was a loner. He had no friends. That he was a weird young man in school. The expression was to pull a Dahmer was to do something outrageous and wild and wacky and so forth. And I have to admit, when I read about some of the wacky things he did as a teenager, well, I did some wacky things in college too. You know, it was just kind of that breaking up period of time when you do things. So I couldn't really hold him guilty for that. He got into alcohol very young in his life, and that would become a major part of what was going on in his life as well. It's very hard to explain how he initially got into the whole thing about killing people. He doesn't really give a good explanation of that himself, other than his simple explanation of how it happened. His parents were going through a divorce. And when I met Lionel, this process of divorce had started actually many years earlier, and culminated when Jeffrey was a high school graduate. And when he gets out of high school, both his parents have had such a terrible fight that, assuming the other one's going to stay at home, each of them flees. So mother goes to her mother's place with younger brother David, and father checks into a motel, and they think they're staying away from each other, and all they've done is they basically abandoned Jeff, and he's all alone, all by himself. And so he decides to do something. He gets into a car and drives around and finds a hitchhiker, and he had been toying with this in earlier times, toying with the idea. And as we get a little bit later, when we get to the urges and the things that he fought with, he had some urges he was trying to overcome. Some of the urges had to do with homosexualness. Some of them had to do with an interest in dead bodies. He is reported as taking little animals that he found in the woods behind him and not only killing them, but dissecting them and so forth. And there's a part of me that can't really blame him for that. I remember being a young boy and being kind of fascinated with those sorts of things too. I found dissecting a frog in science class icky, but exciting at the same time. And so there's a part of me that kind of struggled with, you're holding him guilty for that. Just because he did that doesn't necessarily mean he was going to do it later on. Just because a child is cruel to one creature doesn't mean he's going to be cruel to other creatures later on as well too. I remember being a boy catching fireflies and tearing off the little ends So yeah, and finally they lit, and not really thinking that I'm killing the bug in the process of doing that. I remember catching ants and catching a bee and putting them in a jar, you know, and letting them fight until, you know, basically usually the ants kill the bee is what it came down to, and that was just nothing but cruelty that young boys do. And I don't think I became necessarily an unusual, evil person because of that. And so there's a part of me that can sympathize with young Jeff. Yet at the same time, he's suffering from this sense of loss of family and the abandonment. And I'll get more into that when we get more into his story, especially in the memorial service. His victims were mostly homosexuals and minorities. He had found them at bathhouses, shopping malls, and gay bars. Their sexual preference did not really matter to him, nor their race. His first two victims were white. The third was an American Indian. The fourth and fifth were Hispanic. What attracted him most was their looks. He searched for a certain profile. Men in their late teens or mid-20s, of medium height with slender builds and smooth skin. His method rarely varied. He discovered that weekends were best so that their families would not miss the victims for a few days. He would offer them money, usually to pose nude for photographs, or invite them home for homosexual acts. Once inside, he would then photograph them in handcuffs, performed what he called light sex, kissing, fondling, oral sex, sometimes masturbation. He was not sadistic. He would drug his victims to unconsciousness and then sexually assault them while they were asleep and finally strangle them to death. None of them ever suffered, at least according to him, nor did he cause any agony or great pain in their dying. This was something his mother agonizes over when you read the article about her, how he tried to convince her afterward that they were unconscious so they weren't feeling any pain, and she scoffs at this and says, how can you say that? You don't know they weren't feeling pain. As time went by, he grew weary of killing them and yearned for a way to keep them alive. He began to experiment on some. One of the things about Jeff is he idolized his father. His father was a scientist, and Jeff wanted to be a scientist like his father, but he never really had the schooling to be a scientist. And so I believe he sort of played at being a scientist at times. And so he began experimenting on some of them, giving them makeshift lobotomies. He would drill a hole into their skull and pour acid into their brain cavity in an attempt to kill off their intellect but keep their bodies alive. If he could succeed, he wouldn't have to kill anymore. He wanted complete, total control over other people, not having to consider their wishes. This effort never worked, however, and they all died. He enjoyed cutting the bodies apart and marveled at the colors of the internal organs and the glistening of the most vital organs. He was fascinated by what he saw. Eventually, he tried to cook and eat some body parts. He said it made him feel as if they were part of him, and also gave him a great sexual satisfaction to do that. Most people remember the quotes of him when he was first arrested. They found some body parts in a freezer, and they asked what was this for, and he said, well, that's to be eaten later. He was saving that to eat later on. Whether he actually did or not, I don't really know. But to me, he only confessed eating one bicep muscle, is all he ever confessed to me anyway about eating.